Hi, I'm Mace Chang, and I'm excited to be here today to tell you about how to assess your next startup opportunity. Joining a startup can be a big risk. You might not get paid as much as you would at a larger company. You will likely be working pretty long hours. So it's really important when you're thinking about joining a startup to really think like an investor and do a lot of research to figure out if this is the right startup for you to join. In terms of my background, I have spent a lot of my career working across startups, really from all different stages, really from C to IPO. The first startup that I joined is usually what people think about when they think about a startup. It was 8 people. We all sat at the same table. We had lunch together every day. And when I collaborated cross functionally, a lot of times what that meant was I would collaborate with myself working on different things. So, one day I'd be doing business development, account management with customers, and then I would take the feedback I hear from that and turn that into product requirements. And then when it was ready to launch a product, a lot of times what that would mean would be I would create marketing materials and get that to our customers. The second startup that I joined grew and doubled in size from 15 to 30 people while I was there. And I was there as a head of product and was able to really see a company grow and scale and the challenges that come with that. At the beginning of the company when I was there, it was still a lot of, everyone would kind of chip in everywhere. So if this was a week where we really needed to get some marketing or operations efforts out, everyone would chip in into those efforts. And over time, as we doubled in size, one of the challenges was really scaling that up and having different people really start specializing and on different functions in different areas. And then I've also been part of a company that actually went from public to private while I was there on the inside. And so that was a fantastic experience to see what is it like when a private company goes public. And I was there while the company grew from 800 to 1,000 people. And today I am excited to share some of the learnings I've had along the way and make sure that I empower you all with the right questions to ask when you're joining startups. I'll be breaking this down into 3 main points. So a quick question for all of you before we jump in. Are you considering joining a startup for your next job? Is this the first startup that you're thinking of joining? And would love to hear your responses in the chat. Type a yes, no in the chat. So the first lesson that I want to share is that it's really important to really do the homework on the founders and the leadership team of the startup that you're considering joining. There's I think about this in really 2 dimensions. The first is, do the founders have domain expertise? And then the second is, do the founders have execution expertise? So what domain expertise means is, do the founders have a lot of specialization in the domain that they're building a company in? As an example, for one of the startups that I was part of, Zymergen, 2 of the founders, so Zymergen was a biotech company, and 2 of the founders had PhDs in the specific field that we were in, and they also had execution expertise, having been at another similar company in this space. For execution expertise, a really good example of this is Halo Tech, which was the seed stage startup that I joined. The founder of that company had spent his career building B2B SaaS companies, and Halo Tech was a CRM company. We were in a market that the founder had never been in before, life sciences. But because of his really extensive background across the B2B SaaS space, I was confident that he would bring in the right subject matter expertise to be successful in the life sciences space, and also that he really knew what it took to build a company in the B2B SaaS space. So what does this mean for you? So for you, it's important to figure out if your founders have either the domain or execution expertise, or better yet, both. If a founder or founders of the company you're considering don't have either, that can be okay too, but it's important to really do your homework on the background of the founders and the leadership team. Do the founders have transferable experiences from adjacent industries, or would they really bring in the leadership team and allow them to operate as the domain or execution expert stand-ins. I'll also add that this is especially important if you're considering startups that are earlier stage and smaller. So especially when you're at a seed or Series A company, this is where it's really important that you especially research the founders and leadership team, because in those companies, that's when you'll be like, those teams are much smaller and you'll be working really closely with the leadership teams. Now, to switch gears a little bit, I'll be talking about a common topic that you hear a lot about in the news about startups. So one question I have for all of you is, raising more funding is always better, true or false? And again, type your responses in the chat. I really want to hear from you. So the answer to this is actually false. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but raising more funding is not always better. And the really critical thing to remember is that funding is not the same as revenue. And if you're ever in a situation where you're talking to a leadership team of a startup and they confuse the two, that's definitely a flag. The second lesson I want to share is, for funding, it's really important to be just like Goldilocks and have just the right amount of funding. The way I think about funding is how much funding is required for the company to get to its next set of milestones. And what finding Goldilocks means is that it's important that the startup raises the appropriate amount of money, maybe with a little bit of buffer to get them to the next round. And I'll go through why raising too little or raising too much is not good. If a company raises too little, that is a bit more straightforward. You want to make sure that the startup has enough resources and enough funding to make it to the next round. So if a company doesn't raise enough funding, then you run the risk of the company not being able to have enough resources to really make it to that next round and deliver on all the ambitious milestones they have. On the flip side, raising too much can also be challenging. And the reason for this is because when a startup raises money from investors expect startups to spend that money in the short term. They don't want the company to hold on to that money and spend it when they're ready. And what happens when startups raise too much funding too early before they're ready to really grow and scale out is that companies end up demonstrating they might hire a lot of additional headcount, and on paper it looks really successful. This company is rapidly growing and scaling, but they might be solidifying things that aren't quite ready to scale. So what if the company doesn't have product market fit yet? Or what if the product is at a state where it's very buggy and you have to really have an army of a really large support team in order to fulfill all of the different customer requests that come in? And so that's why it's ideal for the company to not raise too much so that they don't end up growing and solidifying in a direction that isn't optimal for their growth. And what this means for you is that when you are assessing a startup, really take a step back and think about, for this startup to reach its next set of milestones, first off, what do you think those milestones should be? And then second, really think like an investor. What do you think that number should be for the funding? And then you should compare the number you came up with the number that the company ended up raising. For fundraising information, that should be very easy to find. Companies really generally like to announce this kind of information, so you should be able to find a lot of press releases or go look on Crunchbase to find information on the company's funding. Two other concepts related to funding are runway and valuation, and I'll explain what both of those are and how you should think about them. I'll start with runway because that is a lot more straightforward. Runway literally means how much time does the company have before they run out of money. And so what this means for you is two things. So the first is, don't be shy about asking a company what its runway is. That's something that all startups will share. For every startup that I've interviewed with, runway was something that either the recruiter shared in the very initial chat, proactively, or something that I was able to ask very early on in the conversation. The second part of runway is to understand for yourself what type of runway you're comfortable with. Are you comfortable with a company that has, less than a year of runway? You're more risk tolerant, or would you be more comfortable with a company that has more runway than that? You should really get a sense of that for yourself so that you know what you're looking for when you figure out the runway for the startup you're considering. Now, valuation is a very complicated topic, and there are whole business school courses dedicated to this. I'm going to spend the next 30 seconds to a minute talking through valuation, so this is going to be a very, very high-level overview. Valuations are essentially risk-adjusted potential of a company. It's how much investors think a company is worth today. And for valuations, what this means for you, it's really important the thing to watch out for is to look out for companies that have valuations that are too high. And this is also a little bit counterintuitive, and I'll explain why. The reason for that is classically, when you think about investing, people always say buy low, sell high. So for valuation, what that means is if the company you're considering already has a high valuation, then it's going to be really hard to buy low, sell high. You'll likely be buying high and selling low. A really good example of this is, for example, WeWork. WeWork had an insanely high valuation, but when it actually went to market, it didn't actually come to fruition. In terms of evaluating the valuation of a company, that can be a bit tricky. There's a couple of ways you can do this. You can definitely ask the company what their latest valuation after a fundraising round was. Some companies might share that, some companies might not share that, and that's also a direct reflection of the kind of culture the company has as well. The other way to think about it is, if you can't find this information readily, is take a step back and ask yourself the question: if this company executed perfectly, they built the perfect product, they got product market fit, they sold to all the right customers, how much would this company actually be worth? And think about that number and compare it to what the valuation they've obtained was, and see if if that valuation is too high. And that's a good way to figure out, is the main thing to be careful of is the valuation of the company too high. And so whenever you're considering a startup, it's always important to consider the fundraising, the amount of runway, and also the valuation. And last but not least, you also want to think about the exit strategy for the company. This is important for all stages because this directly impacts how much your equity is worth. And when people think about equity, or when people think about exit strategies, they usually think of it one of two ways. One is that, and they're on opposite extremes. So one is that the company folds, it fails completely, everyone is laid off, and the company no longer exists. The flip side of that is the company goes IPO and it's wildly successful. The startup becomes the next Google, and everyone at the company becomes millionaires overnight. So those are usually the two opposite extremes that people think about. The reality is that there are a lot of other exits as well. It's actually quite common for companies to remain private indefinitely, especially if a company generates revenue and it's sustainable. The company may not see the need to go on the public markets. In fact, a lot of founders actually prefer to keep companies private because it's a lot of work to be a public company. You have a lot more requirements and regulations you have to follow. And then another exit is an acquisition. And for the acquisition, this means that your company gets acquired by another company for either IP. So is the company building some really cool, innovative, cutting edge technology that another company would want to purchase? In maybe this startup you're considering is a competitor for another larger player, and the larger player wants to acquire the startup in order to prevent the competition from overtaking them. So think of Facebook Meta acquiring Instagram and WhatsApp. It's also possible that the startup you're in has an amazing team and another company wants to acquire this team. There's a lot of reasons why a company would get acquired, but that's also another possible exit. And the reason, one of the reasons for understanding the exit strategy even early on is so that you can fully assess the value of the equity you're getting in the startup. When you join a startup, there's definitely an opportunity cost, and you want to figure out, is the opportunity worth the trade-off? And then another way to also think about this is what these exits mean for your equity. So if the company folds, then you likely won't get anything back. If the company remains private indefinitely, you might be able to sell some of your shares on the secondary market. If a company gets acquired or has an IPO, that could also go either way. This goes back to the valuation. So if the valuation of a company is too high, then that's when this becomes really important, is when you have an exit. If the valuation of the company is really too high, then during acquisition or IPO, you as an employee may get very little back. Generally, when an exit happens, the investors always get paid first, and employees get paid later. So that's why valuation is really important, because in these scenarios, if the valuation is too high, then for acquisition or IPO, that's you'll likely get you likely won't see too much of your equity back. But if the valuation was low, then and the company got acquired or IPO'd at a very favorable price, then that could work out very well for you. Startup equity is also its own whole world, and there's a lot of unique terms and concepts that you don't see when working at more established companies. One important point I want to share is that for a lot of startups, they will often offer lower salaries than a more established company. And so it's really important that you get equity from a startup for a full-time role. I strongly believe that all startups should offer some equity to all full-time roles. And the reason for this is because this is one of the benefits that a startup can provide, is that it can give equity to early employees. A typical investment schedule that you'll hear is a typical term you'll hear in the startup world is, a typical vesting schedule is 4 years with a 1-year cliff. Now, what does that mean in English? So what that means is 1-year cliff means that you have to last at least a year before you get any of your shares. So say you're at a startup and you're 10 months in and you're really having trouble getting along with the founders and you have to leave the company. Well, if you're leaving at 10 months, then you haven't reached the 1-year cliff, and so you will not be able to purchase any of your shares. And the other piece of this is, the typical vesting schedule is 4 years. So that means that you get your whole equity package if you stay the entire 4 years. If you only plan on staying at the startup for 2 years, then the most you'll ever get from your equity is 2 out of the 4 years you were originally granted in your package. The last point is equity is not free, but as an early employee, one of the benefits of joining a startup is you get to pay a much lower price than what the investors will pay for investing in the startup. And that price is your strike price. So it's the unique price that you as an early employee get to pay to own equity in the startup. And overall, it's really important to understand your vesting schedule and what that means for your equity in the future. So in summary, thank you for spending some time with me today. I was excited to share different things I've learned, assessed having worked across startups really from seed to IPO. And in summary, it's really important when you're joining a startup to really do your homework on the startup. The first is do your due diligence on the founders and the leadership team. It's important to understand their level of domain expertise and also their level of execution expertise. Ideally, the founders should have both. Founders are so important to the future direction of the startup, and it's really important that you really do your research on the founders and see if they're leaders you want to work with. The second topic was understanding funding. More funding is not always better. It's important to raise just the right amount of funding so that you can make it to your next milestone. And then last but not least, even in early stage startups, it's important to understand the exit strategy so that you understand how much your equity is potentially worth. And that also goes back to the mini lesson on valuations, where the thing you really want to be careful of is if the valuation is too high. I'm always happy to connect about talking about product and startups, or even just talk startups more generally. And so if you have any additional questions, I'm happy to connect or chat offline. Here's my email address, and here is my LinkedIn as well. Thank you.